All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is arguably one of the most powerful and definitely the most heavily scrutinized roles on the planet. I want you to think about the U.S. Constitution for a second. We usually think of it as this grand framework for a nation, right? But in a lot of ways, it's actually the ultimate job posting for the highest office in the land. It lays out the exact qualifications, a highly specific hiring process, and a massive, massive list of daily duties. So whether you're a political science buff or really just someone trying to make sense of the daily news cycle, understanding the actual structural mechanics of this job is absolutely essential. Let's dig in.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 5 things. Number 1, the resume, looking at qualifications. Number 2, the hiring process, also known as the Electoral College. Number 3, daily executive duties. 4, legislative and judicial roles. And finally, number 5, the contingency plan, or succession.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, the presidential job requirements.
Now, before we even talk about age or citizenship, we really have to establish the foundational difference between a parliamentary system and our presidential system. You see, in a parliamentary system, the prime minister holds the executive authority, sure, but they are still functionally a part of the legislature. In the U.S., it's a completely different ballgame. The president is both the head of state and the head of government, holding supreme executive authority. And here is the absolutely crucial part. The U.S. president operates completely outside of Congress. They are not a member of the legislative branch simply because they're elected through an entirely separate, totally distinct mechanism.
So, who actually gets past the resume screening to apply for this 4-year term? Well, the Constitution lays out 3 incredibly strict requirements. First off, you gotta be at least 35 years old. Second, you must have lived within the United States for a minimum of 14 years. And third, you must be a natural-born American citizen. Now, this is a vital distinction to make. If you are a non-citizen who immigrated to the U.S. and then later successfully acquired American citizenship through the naturalization process, you are actually constitutionally barred from holding the presidency. There's no way around it. You must be a citizen by birth.
Moving right along to Section 2, winning the Electoral College.
Okay, so here's the thing. Winning the popular vote isn't actually what gets you the keys to the White House. The whole hiring process revolves around the math of the Electoral College. In the U.S., voters are actually choosing electors. Every state gets a very specific number of electoral votes, and that number is completely dependent on their representation in Congress. So it's calculated by adding their number of senators, which is always 2, no matter what, to their number of House representatives, which varies based on the state's population. If we look nationally, there are 100 senators, plus 435 House members, plus 3 special electoral votes given to Washington, D.C. You add all that up, and you get exactly 538 total electoral votes up for grabs. By the way, if you appreciate seeing the electoral math broken down visually like this, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
So looking at that 538, it all comes down to this magic number right here, 270. Out of those 538 total votes, a candidate has to achieve an absolute majority to win the presidency. Securing 270 electoral votes is literally the finish line of the hardest job interview on earth. It's the ultimate threshold, and really the only metric that officially hires a candidate for the job.
All right, let's jump into Section 3, Executive Powers and Duties.
So you got the job. Now what do you actually do? Well, the primary role of the president is acting as the chief executive or chief administrator. They are quite literally the person in charge of the national government. Their core constitutional mandate is to ensure that the Constitution, all laws, treaties, and federal court decisions are properly executed across the entire country. And obviously, nobody is allowed to violate those federal mandates. But let's be real, one person cannot do this alone, right? Which is exactly why the president relies heavily on a massive, sprawling federal bureaucracy made up of millions of employees to help enforce the law day in and day out.
Alongside being chief executive, the president also steps into the role of commander-in-chief. This means they are the supreme commander of the U.S. Armed Forces. And wow, this is a massive, sobering responsibility. The president is directly responsible for the nation's defense. They're the one formulating foreign policy, determining our relations with other countries, and handpicking all the top military officers to actually execute those global defense strategies. But as we know, the founders absolutely did not want a king, so they designed this brilliant system of checks and balances. The president has immense power to, say, negotiate foreign policy treaties and appoint department heads, ambassadors, military officers, the whole shebang. However,
All of those powers are firmly tied to congressional checks. If the president negotiates a treaty, it means nothing until the Senate actually godstamps it with a two-thirds majority approval. Or if the president appoints a new department head, that person cannot officially take the job until the Senate gives their absolute formal approval. Now, the president also has the power to pardon, meaning they can reduce a penalty or entirely forgive a crime. But again, strict limits apply here. The pardon is strictly allowed for federal crimes only. If someone commits a state crime, the president has absolutely zero authority to step in. That power belongs entirely to the state's governor. Furthermore, the pardon power is completely 100% blocked during an impeachment process. So a president cannot just pardon their way out of being impeached to save their own job.
Which brings us to Section 4, legislative and judicial roles. So even though the president isn't actually a member of Congress, they still wield significant legislative influence. And that starts with the power to send messages to Congress. When a president wants to get lawmakers on board with a specific issue, they formally address them to set the legislative agenda. A really clear historical example of this happened right after the 9/11 attacks. President George W. Bush sent a special message and addressed Congress to outline his future plan for the war on terror. He was effectively using this power to urge the legislative branch to align with his strategic vision. But of course, the president's most famous legislative tool is the veto. When Congress passes a bill, it needs the president's signature to become official law. If the president doesn't like it, they can use their veto power, block it, and send it right back. But wait, it isn't an absolute roadblock. If Congress is determined to get that law passed, they can reconsider it. And if both the Senate and the House of Representatives pass it again, but this time with a two-thirds majority, they override the president's veto completely. At that point, the bill automatically becomes law, and the president's signature is totally irrelevant. Now, on the judicial side of things, the president holds this incredibly consequential power to shape the courts. The president is the one who appoints the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as well as all the other federal judges. And because these are lifetime appointments, a president's influence can literally last for decades after their four-year term is over. But just like we saw with treaties and executive appointments, the check and balance comes right back into play. Every single judicial appointment strictly requires Senate approval before it becomes final.
Finally, let's hit Section 5, the line of succession.
The Constitution goes out of its way to ensure there is never a vacuum of power. It establishes a very strict line of succession. If the president does, or just can't fulfill the duties of the office, the vice president immediately steps up. If, for some terrible reason, the vice president is also unable to fill the vacancy, the Speaker of the House of Representatives is next in line. If the Speaker can't serve, it falls to the President pro tempore of the Senate. And if they are unable, the role goes to the Secretary of State. It's this incredibly rigid chain of command designed so we are literally never left without a leader. And yes, this is exactly the constitutional protocol that inspired the whole designated survivor TV trope, guaranteeing the continuity of the U.S. government under pretty much any circumstances.
So what does this all mean? Taking all of this in, the strict resume requirements, the brutal math of those 270 electoral votes, the massive burden of being commander-in-chief, and that constant, never-ending tug-of-war with Congress, it leaves us with a really fascinating thought. With so many distinct powers and such incredibly strict checks and balances built into the system, is the U.S. presidency the most complex job ever created? Or, because of those very restraints, is it actually the most fragile? I want you to think about that. If you enjoyed this breakdown and you know fellow political science enthusiasts who would love a really clear look at how our system works, be sure to share this explainer with them. Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.